Christopher Mills had been blind since birth. Born 3 months premature in a small hospital in Mobile, Alabama, he came into this world weighing barely 2 pounds, his tiny lungs struggling for every breath. The oxygen that saved his life also stole his sight, leaving his retinas permanently damaged. His mother, Sarah, a single parent working 2 jobs to keep their small apartment, had cradled him in those early days and whispered promises that she would give him the best life possible, even if he would never see a sunset or her smile. Growing up without sight meant Christopher experienced the world differently. While other children played video games and watched cartoons, he listened. He listened to everything. The rhythm of rain against windows. The melody of his mother's laughter. The songs that poured from the small radio in their kitchen. But most of all, he listened to the music at their church, a modest building with chipped paint and creaking pews where Sarah took him every Sunday without fail. It was in that church where Christopher discovered his voice. He was only 5 years old when he first stood before the small congregation and sang, "Amazing Grace." The pastor had invited children to participate in the service, and before Sarah could stop him, Christopher had felt his way to the front, his small hands trailing along the pews. When he sang, his voice pure and unburdened by self-consciousness, the entire congregation fell silent. Grown men wept. Women clasped their hands to their chests. Even Reverend Johnson had to pause and collect himself before continuing the service. From that day forward, music became Christopher's language, his way of touching a world he could not see. Sarah scraped together enough money for voice lessons with Mrs. Patterson, a retired opera singer who lived 3 blocks away. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, Christopher would make that walk, his white cane tapping out a rhythm on the sidewalk, his mother holding his other hand. By the time Christopher turned 10, he had performed at dozens of local events, church gatherings, and community centers. His voice had matured into something remarkable, an instrument that seemed too powerful, too full of emotion to belong to someone so young. But Sarah knew her son had a gift that deserved a bigger platform. When she saw the announcement for America's Got Talent auditions coming to Birmingham, just 2 hours away, she made a decision that terrified her. She would take Christopher to audition. The morning of the audition, Christopher woke up with a fever. Sarah felt his forehead and her heart sank. It was burning hot. She gave him medicine, prayed over him, and nearly turned the car around a dozen times on the drive to Birmingham. Christopher, sensing his mother's worry, squeezed her hand and said, "Mama, if this is meant to be, God will make a way. If it isn't, we'll go home and have ice cream instead." The waiting area was chaos. Hundreds of hopeful performers crowded into the space, each one desperate for their moment. Christopher sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the nervous chatter around him. A production assistant approached them, took one look at Christopher's flushed face, and pulled Sarah aside. "Ma'am, your son looks ill. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Sarah looked at Christopher, who was now trembling slightly, whether from fever or nerves she couldn't tell. She was about to withdraw when Christopher spoke up. "Please, Mama, I need to do this. Not for me. For everyone like me who thinks they can't." They were called to the stage 3 hours later. As Christopher walked out, guided by his mother's hand, the massive auditorium seemed to swallow them whole. 12,000 seats surrounded them. 4 judges sat at their table, their expressions neutral. The bright lights, which Christopher could sense as warmth on his face even if he couldn't see them, felt like the sun itself. Host Terry Crews approached them with his signature warmth. "Hey there, young man. What's your name?" "Christopher Mills, sir. I'm 10 years old, and I'm from Mobile, Alabama. And what are you going to do for us today, Christopher?" "I'm going to sing, sir. I'm going to sing for Jesus." Simon Cowell, known for his brutal honesty, leaned forward. "Christopher, I can see you're using a cane. Can you tell us about that?" "I'm blind, sir. I've been blind since I was born. But my mama always tells me that just because I can't see doesn't mean I can't shine." The audience erupted in applause. Heidi Klum had tears in her eyes before Christopher had sung a single note. But then Simon did something unexpected. He raised his hand for silence and looked concerned. "Christopher, you look quite unwell. Are you feeling all right?" Sarah stepped forward, about to speak, but Christopher found his voice first. "I have a fever, sir. I've had it since this morning. But I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. If you'll let me, I'd like to try. Simon exchanged glances with the other judges. Howie Mandel shook his head slightly, concerned. Sofia Vergara looked worried. The audience held its breath. Simon Cowell, the judge who had crushed 1,000 dreams, sat back in his chair. All right, Christopher. Let's hear what you've got. The music began. Christopher had chosen Waymaker, a contemporary Christian song that had become his anthem. But for the first 15 seconds, nothing came out. Christopher stood frozen, his mouth open, his body shaking. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Simon started to lean forward, perhaps to stop the audition. Then Christopher did something no one expected. He lifted his face upward, toward lights he couldn't see, toward a heaven he believed in with his whole heart. And when he sang, it wasn't just a voice that emerged. It was pure, unleashed emotion. It was every struggle he had ever faced, every moment he had wished he could see his mother's face, every time he had been told he couldn't or shouldn't because of his blindness, all transformed into something beautiful. His voice cracked with fever and emotion on the high notes, but it only made the performance more raw, more real. Tears streamed down his face as he sang about miracles, about a God who makes ways where there seemed to be none. The entire auditorium was weeping. Cameramen wiped their eyes behind their equipment. Even the notoriously stoic Simon Cowell stood up from his chair, his hand over his heart. When Christopher finished, the silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then 12,000 people erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a standing ovation that seemed to shake the building. People were shouting, crying, holding on to each other. Terry Crews was openly sobbing. Heidi had to leave the judges' table briefly to compose herself. Simon spoke first, his voice thick with emotion. Christopher, in 20 years of doing this show across multiple countries, I have never, and I mean never, been so moved by a performance. You didn't just sing. You ministered to every single person in this room. That was extraordinary. Howie added, you took your pain, your struggle, and you turned it into something that connected with all of us. That's not just talent. That's a gift from God. All 4 judges slammed their hands down on the golden buzzers simultaneously, something that had never happened in the show's history. Golden confetti rained down on Christopher, who stood confused until his mother ran to him and whispered in his ear what had happened. He collapsed into her arms, his small body racked with sobs of joy and relief. But the story doesn't end there. That performance went viral within hours, reaching over 100 million views in 3 days. Christopher's fever broke that night in their hotel room, as if his body had held on just long enough for his moment. Sarah received calls from record labels, from churches wanting him to perform, from families across the country sharing how Christopher's song had brought them hope during their darkest times. Christopher Mills went on to finish 3rd in the competition, but what he won was so much more than a trophy. He won the hearts of a nation. He proved that limitations are often just illusions. He showed that the most powerful gift isn't what we can see, but what we can make others feel. Today, Christopher travels the country singing, his mother still by his side, his white cane tapping out new rhythms on stages from coast to coast. And every time he performs, he dedicates his song to Jesus, to the God he believes gave him a voice when he couldn't have eyes.